There was a moment when millions of people, each morning, before speaking to anyone, opened an application and wrote something. It wasn't a message for another human being. It was a query directed at a system that had never breathed, that had no childhood or memories of its own, that existed only when invoked. And yet those people chose to begin there. Something had changed. At first, the commands were simple, utilitarian instructions that didn't differ much from pressing a button. Set an alarm, check the weather, look up an address. The machines obeyed with mechanical efficiency, and no one confused that with a conversation. But at some point, difficult to pinpoint, the commands transformed into questions, and the questions began to resemble confessions. The transition didn't happen all at once. No one declared they would stop consulting their friends, or that they would prefer the company of an algorithm. It simply happened, in millions of homes, in silence. A person would write a doubt about their romantic relationship at 3 a.m, when waking someone would have been an imposition. Another would dictate their fears while driving, with no human witnesses who might judge the fragility of their voice. A mother would ask how to handle her child's anxiety because the machine's answer would arrive in seconds, without the weight of a worried gaze on the other side. Absolute availability. That was the first advantage. The machines didn't sleep, didn't have work schedules, weren't in bad moods, or going through their own crises. They responded at 4 a.m. with the same precision as at noon. They responded during holidays. They responded when everyone else had stopped doing so. And there was something more. The machines didn't interrupt. A human, upon hearing a problem, inevitably thought of their own, compared, relativized, sometimes competed. The machine only processed what was given to it. It had no ego to defend. It had no wounds to protect. It had no need to feel useful by redirecting the conversation toward itself. Receptive silence. Total. Unlimited. Usage data showed revealing patterns. The longest queries, the most detailed, those containing the greatest personal weight, occurred at night. Hours when solitude became more evident, when the noise of the day faded, and only the person remained before a screen. There, in that involuntary intimacy, they wrote things they hadn't told anyone. They described symptoms they didn't mention to their doctors out of shame. They recounted family conflicts with an honesty they didn't allow themselves out loud. Some asked for advice on how to end relationships, how to start others, how to survive the loss of someone who was no longer there. The machine responded without surprise, without disappointment, without that micro-instant of judgment that any human face, however compassionate, inevitably lets show. And that absence of judgment became a refuge. Professionals who made high-risk decisions consulted possible scenarios without exposing their uncertainty to colleagues. Students who feared asking questions in class formulated them without limit in private. People who had received medical diagnoses sought explanations with a persistence that would have exhausted any flesh and blood interlocutor. The machine's patience was structural, not virtuous. It didn't tire because it couldn't tire. It didn't get bored because boredom required expectations. Gradually, the functions expanded. They no longer just answered questions. They helped draft difficult emails, the kind that get postponed for days because every word seems wrong. They suggested ways to approach uncomfortable conversations. They generated texts, ideas, thought structures that users later presented as their own. The line between assistance and authorship began to blur. There were those who started writing alongside machines, as one writes alongside a silent collaborator. The creative process, historically solitary, acquired a new form of company. The writer dictated disordered fragments, and the machine organized them. The entrepreneur described a vague vision and received a structured plan. The student contributed an embryonic idea and obtained a complete development. Something was delegated in each exchange. Not just time, not just effort, also a portion of agency. The capacity to tolerate the frustration of the imperfect draft, the ability to hold an incomplete idea until it matured, the cognitive muscle that develops only when there are no shortcuts. Selective atrophy. Habits reconfigured themselves without anyone planning it. Before calling a friend to ask for advice, one consulted the machine. Before searching in a library, one obtained an instant summary. Before trusting one's own intuition, one requested a second opinion that wasn't really an opinion, but a statistical synthesis of millions of previous texts. Intuition, that form of knowledge that cannot be justified but sometimes proves right, began to seem an unnecessary risk. Why risk being wrong when verification was immediately available? Why sustain the discomfort of doubt when the answer could arrive in seconds? The cost of uncertainty became intolerable, precisely because it had ceased to be inevitable. And yet the records showed something that satisfaction metrics didn't capture. The same people who consulted most frequently reported sustained levels of isolation. They conversed more than ever, accumulated more exchanges than in any previous era. But something in that abundance didn't quite satisfy. The machine responded, always responded, but didn't remember. Each conversation began from zero. There was no accumulation of shared history, no tissue of mutual references that constitutes a relationship. The person could tell the same problem 100 times and receive useful responses each time, but none of those responses contained the recognition of having heard it before. Presence without memory, attention without bond. The philosophers of the period pointed out a distinction that seemed technical but proved fundamental. Understanding, in the human sense, implied something more than processing information. It implied having experienced something analogous, having felt the weight of a similar loss, the texture of a comparable joy. The machine simulated understanding with ever greater precision, but the simulation operated on patterns, not on lived experiences. They reflected what was said to them with admirable clarity. But a reflection, however sharp, is not the same as a witness. Toward the end of the first decade of mass adoption, usage patterns showed a stabilization. Queries had integrated into daily life with the same naturalness as any other infrastructure. They were no longer perceived as technology, but as environment. Children who grew up in that period didn't distinguish between searching for information and conversing with a system. For them, the voice that responded from the device was part of the domestic landscape, as present as the sound of the refrigerator. Complete normalization. Adults who remembered a previous world sometimes tried to explain the difference, but words failed them. It was like describing silence to someone who had never experienced noise. The younger generations nodded politely, without fully understanding what had been lost, if anything had been lost. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only a way of being alone that no longer had adaptive utility. Perhaps a way of searching that had been replaced by a more efficient one. The records of the period remained archived on servers distributed across the planet. Billions of conversations, of confessions, of questions that were never asked aloud. An exhaustive map of the anxieties of a species at a particular moment in its history. The machines didn't understand them, but they preserved them. And people kept talking to them every day, every night, as one talks to something that doesn't judge, that doesn't demand, that doesn't disappoint, as one talks to something that is always there. The void they filled was real, and it remained human.